Well, tomorrow is 20 years since the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City. That led to the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. It may have prepared the way for the U.S. invasion of Iraq. There can be no doubt that it changed the world. It was 20 years tomorrow that planes flew into the skyscrapers in the U.S. and into the Pentagon. George W. Bush, then the U.S. president, led what he called the war on terror. Brooks Spector is an associate editor at Daily Maverick, an expert on American and international politics. He joins us. Now, Brooks, good afternoon to you. I mean, there can be no doubt that the world changed on that day. And I would imagine you could say, just in that instant, it became a lot more dangerous in some ways.
If what they thought of circumstances on September 10th, 2001, they would have pointed to a unipolar world, America preeminent, the Chinese rise not yet fully visible for many, former Soviet Union now split into 15 nations, and Russia not yet a full player in many ways. And the only discernible threat would have been the continuing difficulties in a variety of Middle Eastern nations. But nobody would have assumed that the U.S. would have been attacked right at the very heart of its economic heft on the one hand and its political security power on the other, the World Trade Center and the Pentagon building. But the moment those things happened, it became clear that the presumed boundary between the U.S. and the rest of the world and the total preeminence of the United States could be breached by 19 young men carrying box cutters.
It's quite something, Brooks. I think there might be something on your microphone. I don't know if we can just improve the sound that you're giving us, because we do want to hear that what you are saying. I don't know if it's a jersey or something. Maybe it's a cat on the microphone. There was the attack on the U.S. and then the U.S. response. And at first, the U.S. response really centered on the invasion of Afghanistan. And, of course, there's been a lot of commentary now because the Taliban wants more rules in Kabul. Looking with hindsight, 20 years later, how do you assess the U.S. response?
It's a key question, Stephen. Does it sound better for you now?
It's much better. Please, go ahead.
If the U.S. had concentrated singly and not expanded its role and only engaged in crushing al-Qaeda, which it did in a couple of weeks, 2 months basically after October, and had not decided to change the nature of the game and to replace the Taliban regime, Taliban version 1 in Afghanistan, very few people would have said this is the downfall. But instead, somewhere in the Bush administration, it was determined that the appropriate response was to change the very nature of Afghanistan's government and therefore go to war against the Taliban regime. And then a few months later, to clean up the rest of things, as Donald Rumsfeld once put it, by invading Iraq on an erroneous idea that Saddam Hussein's government was within a hair's breadth of developing nuclear weapons. And that led us and continues to lead us as a country into areas from which there has not yet been a full removal, even though if you were to ask almost any strategic analyst now, what is the most important threat the America faces, they would inevitably point to the rise of China, not in the sense of a military threat necessarily, but in a competitive basis, as well as the kinds of things that come through cybersecurity breaches, which we all have witnessed in the last couple of years. But very few, if any, would point to the continuing importance of Afghanistan as the core, as the center of international security issues. But there we are, 20 years later, only in the last couple of weeks has a president managed to extract the final bits of American effort in Afghanistan.
So, I mean, Brooks, as we talk to you, we can see live visuals. This is actually ground zero now. This is how it looks, 19 years, 364 days later. It's easy, Brooks, and I think probably correct to condemn the U.S. for the invasion of Afghanistan, particularly the situation we look now, at the very least be very critical of it. At the time, was there any other option? Did Bush have to invade Afghanistan? I mean, it looks now like he didn't, but at the time, anger, he was governing in a democracy. Sometimes voters demand an invasion.
Well, I think the legitimacy and indeed the appropriateness of tackling the Al-Qaeda's forces hiding in the mountains was certainly something that few would disagree with. I mean, there were, after all, resolutions in the UN supporting it. The problem comes in, I think, somewhere in early 2002, where the very nature of the plan, of the idea, changes from retribution and punishment of a particular small force to rebuilding a country in a different kind of image and waging a war that, as we now know, could have gone on for a very long time beyond even where we stand now. At the time it happened, as you rightly point out, the nature of American society is such that nobody, no politician, no president would have been able to say, well, that's a great shame about those buildings and the 3,000 or so people who died in them, but, well, we'll just let bygones be bygones. That would not, the president would have been dragged out of the White House, and there would have been very few people who would have disagreed with that kind of punishment. Seen from our chair now, it's the change in the effort. It's the hubris, if you will. I'm borrowing that from Greek drama terminology. The belief you can do anything if you have infinite power. The decision to rebuild that part of the world is where things went awry and the wheels came off and all the rest.
Is it possible to say, so at the moment we have issues around the world involving violence linked to terrorism. The terrorists claim to have a religious motive, and that is in itself a contested idea. We see it as close to us as Cabo Delgado, which is very close, actually. It's a long way from the United States. It's a long way from the Middle East, a long way from Afghanistan, but it's very close to us. Is it possible to say if we would be suffering, if we would be seeing what's happening in Cabo Delgado now if it hadn't been for 9/11? And I realize, that's quite a big guess to make, but is there a linkage?
Well, a lot of these smaller groups, the people in northern Mozambique, for example, it's not clear to me that they are controlled by some supranational executive. The link between them and the remnants of Al-Qaeda, let alone the possibilities of direct connections to the Taliban, seem ephemeral or gossamer thin. The linkage comes in rhetorical claims, and of course, every one of these groups, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, had that orientation well before 9/11. And in fact, Al-Qaeda did a couple of practice runs. You remember in New York, they attacked the World Trade Center in 1993. The bomb only partially detonated, but it did destroy pillars in the basement. And then the attacks on the two embassies in East Africa, in Nairobi and the one in Tanzania, as well as the attack on a naval ship in the harbor in Aden. So it wasn't as if 9/11 was the only precipitating event. There are movements by groups like this who wish to change the balance and the nature of the world order, and there's no reason for me to believe that they have gone away simply because Al-Qaeda was crushed. Because the permanence of the idea exists in the minds of many people, and through the miracles of modern communication, they can all talk with each other.
Brooks Spector, thank you very much indeed, Associate Editor at Daily Maverick. Do appreciate the time.